Welcome back, sports fans. This week's magic number is 9. Darren, as in 9 SEC teams in the top 25,
Oh,
even though the cannibalistic part of the schedule has started when SEC teams start taking out each other. Yes, Vanderbilt
I was I,
survived Ball State.
I was going to
So
do it till you said it. It's a win's a win. Let's not get picky. All right, let's.
that's right. 9 teams in the rankings. We're starting with Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, LSU, Texas A&M, Alabama, Ole Miss, Missouri, and Vanderbilt. So SEC is holding strong and steady as we get
Yep.
closer and closer to that 12-team playoff.
It's you were talking about the cannibalism, and it scares you a little bit when you think about the playoff, but how incredible has every single week been? I mean, and the fact that even though you've just had people just taking each other out, we still got 9 teams. So awesome. It's been a very unique but fun year so far, and we're barely halfway through the season. That's pretty awesome.
We are not prophets. Darren, however, it wasn't that long ago you and I both said there will not be an undefeated SEC team in terms of
That's right.
SEC play. It's just not going to happen. And Georgia, Georgia made us look smart.
And I think there were some Texas fans, if I remember the comments. Let me think back. They didn't really care for that take, if I remember correctly. But I think we may have been on to something. Just saying.
Of the games this past weekend, one that stuck out to me was Tennessee's victory over Alabama.
Definitely.
Knoxville was rocking a 24-17 victory for the Volunteers. Nico showed up, played better. We've talked about his
Hmm.
development over
Hmm.
recent shows. 194 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. On the other side, his counterpart, Jalen Milroe from Alabama, 239 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, the last one sealing the victory for the Volunteers. The story, though, of the game for me, Darren, is again Dylan Sampson.
Oh, yeah.
Over 100 yards, 139 yards against the Crimson Tide defense, 2 touchdowns. He continues to carry this volunteer team.
Hmm.
This is part of Josh Heupel's offensive philosophy. We are going to run the ball. We are going to play solid defense. What changed in this game, though, Darren, was Nico stepped up and made some plays.
Absolutely.
That makes this Tennessee team scarier moving
Yep.
forward.
Yep. And, I have to give credit where credit is due, even if it hurts a little bit. So I'll frame it this way. For this season, the state of Tennessee is 2-0 against Alabama. I think that's a beautiful thing, no matter which. If you look at that from a Middle Tennessee perspective or an East Tennessee perspective, it's a beautiful thing. 2-0 against Alabama.
Do
So
you
I'll
think
just throw
there's
that in.
anything in there? Alabama plays Dixieland Delight a lot. Tennessee's mentioned in Dixieland Delight. Alabama's
Yeah,
never mentioned.
that's right.
Just
And
saying. I'm just
I,
saying.
I, I think you make a very valid point. And just quickly, another moment that kind of stood out to me, um, Brady Cook coming back into the Missouri Auburn game. What really jumped out at me is he came in, he led a great comeback,
Mm-hmm.
but the moment when he ran onto the field
Hmm.
and you could audibly hear the crowd react, there was no doubt they were thrilled out of their minds to have him back on the field. It made me think back to a couple of seasons ago when Coach Drinkwitz was obviously very upset, and he couldn't hide it in a press conference because Brady Cook had not had a very good game and had actually been booed by people in the stands. He stood up for his quarterback. And he said, basically, please don't boo our quarterback. Yeah, this kid's giving it everything he's got. Do not boo our quarterback. So to think about that moment just a couple of years ago, and then have a moment where he comes back on the field and the crowd reacts so loudly that you can pick it up and you know what's happening before the commentators even comment on it. I thought that was a pretty awesome moment. Good for Brady Cook. What a great moment.
You got to love a redemption story.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get into our takeaways from this past week's, again, an incredible weekend of action in the
Absolutely.
SEC. As you survey everything, you've had time to process what happened, Darren. What is your first takeaway from this past weekend?
Well, the first thing that stands out to me, obviously the top 25, kind of getting my attention a little bit right now. Might be a reason. So, we've talked about it before about how preseason polls are not the best. Yeah, but it made me really start to dig in a little bit because if you look at this year's top 25 with the how incredible every single week has been, it had to be even worse than normal. I did a little bit of digging, and what I found is preseason polls have always not been worth a whole lot, but when there was that defined top two or three that in each conference that you knew were going to be there every year, and the parity didn't exist the way it has, it's amazing how much that has really affected the top 25 polls. For instance, right now today, with the AP poll as it exists, there are let's see, make sure I've got my numbers right. 11 teams that were in the top 25 to start the season that aren't now. And there are 11 teams, obviously, that were not in the top 25 to start the season that are now. And if you go back and look through the coaches poll is much easier to access and get years upon years of history, more so than the AP. The coaches poll is even more interesting. I went back and looked from 1996 through this year, um, just at the top 10. And in 96 to, let's say, '06, maybe even '08, they were shooting about 70%, 60 to 70% most of the time. And again, because I was looking at so many years, I just looked at the top 10. I didn't go through all 25, but they were somewhere in the 60 to 70% range that the preseason top 10 was at least close. There were three or four teams that weren't in that ended up, and vice versa. Like I said, six or seven they got right, but over the last 10 to 15 years, it's not even close. Sometimes they're not even 50% on the top 10. And I think I started out looking at all of that to make the point. Kind of my takeaway from it was, as we look at the top 25 as it stands today, it should excite us about where football is, not just the SEC, but all of football, because we get some exciting games week in and week out. But as I looked at the teams that they were wrong about so often, don't want to call anybody out. Starts with Notre, ends with Dame. It was one that really stood out to me quite a bit. There might be a few others. It starts with Florida, ends with State. Again, don't want to call anybody out, but there were some consistent teams that year in and year out would go through stretches that somehow or another started every year in the top 10, yet never finished there. Not missed it a couple of times, but never finished there once over 3, 4, and 5 year stretches. It started to frustrate me a little bit because when you look at last week's top 25, tell me there's a reason that Vanderbilt, with what they had done over the last couple of weeks, should have been out of the top 25 and Michigan should have been in. There is no reason. The only reason Michigan was in last week and Vanderbilt wasn't was because of the bias that is created by already being in the position, because they were ranked in the top 25 before the season even started. And I think Texas showed us exactly how good Michigan was, and then other teams have helped prove the point. So preseason polls are I hope what comes of this 12 team playoff is the people that are truly making those decisions are affected by analytical polls. I don't want to get back to BCS and computers. I'm not even come close to even insinuating that. But I hope there's so many deep analytical polls that are out there. I hope these people that are sitting in the room are using those to make informed decisions and not an AP or a coach's poll that's, at best is an F, and solely makes decisions based off of what last week looked like and who was there 2 weeks ago, as opposed to what teams are doing right now. And I hope the uselessness of preseason polls is exposed by the 12 team playoff, and we can kind of move past that. Now, obviously, what we do and the fun we have, it's good for them to be around because it gives us something to talk about. But I hope part of what comes out of the 12 team playoff is they're nothing more than something for us to talk about. That they don't carry the weight that they have traditionally or historically, that we can get away from that, and some of these other deeper analytical polls start to inform decisions as those 12 teams are put in the playoff outside of the conference championships.
Yeah, I think it's been discussed before on other podcasts, the politics that are sometimes involved in the votes for certain teams, to
Mm-hmm.
particularly the AP poll and
Yep.
even the coaches poll. I've heard people say, well, some of those coaches don't even really pay that much attention.
Oh, yeah, it's an SID. A lot of times it's doing it and just signing the
Yeah.
coach's name.
So you have people that may not be watching all the games
Yep.
and they're casting a vote. Those votes, as you've made in your point, matter a great deal to these programs, particularly programs
Mm-hmm.
that are trying to break into the poll or trying to get into the playoff.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like a recurring theme that we're hearing this year with the presidential election. Your vote matters. Make an
Exactly.
informed vote.
Exactly. Informed decisions, a beautiful thing. What's your first
Goodness.
takeaway?
My first takeaway is the improvement of the LSU defense.
Mm.
Now, they're not a top 10 defense. They're not a top 20 defense. I think overall they're somewhere around 67 was the last I saw. However, when you are 67 on the heels of last year's historically bad LSU defense, it's obvious some improvement has been made. Blake Baker, the new defensive coordinator, is coming in and he is doing a terrific job getting these players to step up. They are playing better. Swinson may break a sack record at LSU this year. Whit Weeks is all over the place. Suddenly, the secondary at LSU is playing better. That I think that all goes to Blake Baker. Here's some examples of the defense. You remember game one against USC? This is horribly painful for me to bring up because USC now we know is really bad. LSU gave up 447 yards to them total offense. Gave up 14 fourth quarter points. They lost that game. They couldn't get off the field in the fourth quarter. Second game, they played Nichols. Let's just skip that. Third game, South Carolina. They gave up 398 total yards, including 243 rushing yards. Somehow, some way, they managed to win that game. Game four, that was the middle of the afternoon. It was 100 zillion degrees in Tiger Stadium, and people were like, "Why would I sit out there? I'm going to stay out here and tailgate the whole time, and we're going to watch the game in a better atmosphere." They gave up 295 total yards, only 15 rushing yards, and they gave up no second half points. That was a win. Against South Alabama, they won 42-10. They gave up 333 total yards, a win. Game six against Ole Miss, that overtime thriller, they gave up 464 yards, the most yards they've given up all year. That's concerning. It was Ole Miss and a very good offense. However, I'm saying this word however a lot tonight. The Tigers only gave up 9 points in the second half and overtime combined to Ole Miss. Incredible defensive performance in the second half. Last week, we saw the defense show up again in a 34-10 victory over Arkansas, giving up only 277 total yards, 38 rushing yards, no fourth quarter points, and a win. Blake Baker is already molding this defense. They are already responding. Harold Perkins goes down, the defense seems to get better. That's not a knock on Harold Perkins. I think that was going to happen regardless if he was playing or not. The defense was going to get better because of what Blake Baker is doing. Now they head into an epic showdown this weekend at College Station against Texas A&M. Darren, they are playing for first place in the SEC.
Yeah.
Who would have predicted that at the beginning of the
Yeah.
season?
Everybody after week one that had Texas A&M, LSU playing for first place on your bingo card, raise your hand. Yeah, exactly. Nobody.
We'll talk more about that game later.
Yeah.
It's going to be a fun one to watch
Oh,
against two
absolutely.
programs that are really playing at a high level right now. I like what Blake Baker's doing with the LSU defense. That's my first takeaway.
And you bring up the Ole Miss game. If I remember the numbers correctly, uh, like you said, they gave up a little over 400 yards, 449,
464.
464. But Ole Miss is averaging per game right at 550. So if you look at it in a from a perspective of percentage wise, your offense held Ole Miss to 80% of their typical output. That's a really, I think that very much accentuates your point that they are
Yeah.
really hitting their stride at the right moment.
Ole Miss, they held to 26 points, Darren. It was a bend
Yeah,
but don't break kind of night.
exactly.
Sometimes you have that. Sometimes you give up quite a few yards, yet you keep them out of the end zone, and that can translate to victories.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a
How
great
about
point.
how about your second takeaway, Darren?
All right. Well, my second takeaway, I want us to do something similar to what we did last week, where we discussed something as my second takeaway, and I want to talk about. There's just not a way we don't talk about it. The Texas Georgia game and the pass interference call. I believe there's about 2:40 left in the third quarter, roughly ish, when that went down. Just in case people have been living under a rock, defensive pass interference was called. An interception was taken off the board, not points, but the interception, and the ball was given back. Um, and the commentators made I think it was a great point. We've talked about the relaxed, lighthearted Sarkisian we're kind of seeing. Boy, that Sarkisian was nowhere to be found when that call was made. That dude, rightfully so. I'm not even trying to be negative about it. Rightfully was losing his mind. There was not a hat, clipboard, or headset that was safe in that moment, and I don't blame him. Um, it was an unreal call. Um, in a land in Louisiana where we've seen pass interference calls have ugly effects on both the collegiate and the pro level, it still kind of blew my mind that call was even made. That the flag even came out of out of the referee's pocket, and I don't want to pile on. I don't want to pick on refs. We love our good friend David Neesmith, and that spent many years as a referee. So we don't want to pick on refs. And I would honestly say I think the SEC officials up until this week, because I don't think it was just this game, I think the SEC officials have had a pretty good year. There's been some glaring ones, but not a plethora, as has sometimes been the case. Thank you, plethora.
Nice word. Nice
Thank you.
word. Golf
But
club.
thank you. Um, so I don't want to just pick on the refs, but um, that was egregious. To use another word, I'll use my
Wow.
that was shout out Dr. Harvey Floyd, Greek professor at Lipscomb, taught me egregious. Thank you, Dr. Floyd. That
Impressive.
was that was overwhelmingly bad. And honestly, I think even to come back later, and I can't say word for word what Kirby Smart said, but he said something to the effect in one of his post game press conferences that or his post game press conference, that he was told that the referee maybe had called it on the wrong person, And he said, I don't want to say too much because I want to respect the SEC office, but he was told something to that extent. And in that moment, in that kind of game, I think to even call the offensive pass interference would have been a ridiculous call. I mean, yes, he extended his hand, he got into the jersey, but those two guys were making contact. Nobody was pulling the other guy down. Nobody's jersey was being yanked away from them. They were playing ball.
First, Darren, I agree completely with you. It was a horrible call, a bad call by the official.
Hmm.
Players make bad plays, officials make bad calls.
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
happens. One of the things that we might need to discuss more, I believe Josh Pate brought this up recently, is that the accountability for college referees. This is not a full time position. These guys have other jobs. When a player makes a play, a bad play, they're held accountable. A coach is held accountable. And you could argue that, well, referees are held accountable, but it takes place privately behind closed doors, whatever. It's just hard to stomach as a fan because what happens most of the time is in a case like this, they made a bad call, and then for some inexplicable reason, they reverse the call without the use of any kind of instant replay. It was not a reviewable call. So what makes them change their mind? Are they looking at the jumbotron, the big screen at the stadium? Do they just get together and say, come to think of it, guys, maybe I got that one wrong? If we open that door where referees can immediately second guess themselves on a call, where does that door end, and where does that, or close? Where does that lead us? It's a nightmare scenario. I hope at some point, with the amount of money generated by college football, we can get full time officials who. Be, I get frustrated as a fan, Darren, because more often than not, something like this happens, and the conference will come out and defend the officials and say, they come up with some explanation that has so many different nuances in it. You need to go ask a philosophy professor, what in the world did they just say? That was a horrible look for the SEC, a horrible look for officiating in the conference. Bad call to start off with. I can understand that.
Yeah.
Horrible
It
call.
it happens. I mean, like you said, like we both said, it's part of the game, unfortunately, but it's part of the
Yeah.
game.
To reverse the call, I don't understand that
No.
any way, shape, or form. The third element to this, Darren, that we need to bring up is the reaction of certain fans.
Yeah.
There were bottles of water thrown on the field. You ever thrown a bottle of water
Not
coming
on the
at a
field.
distance? We need a physics professor on here to tell us
Right.
exactly the damage that a bottle of water could do thrown from a certain distance at a certain
Yep.
speed when it makes contact. We've said this before, and unfortunate situations like this happen with fan bases. This is
Mhm.
not the majority of Texas Longhorn
Right.
fans.
Absolutely.
It is a small percentage. Yet, to use your word, Darren, it was so egregious.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you.
not the only one that's got a dictionary
That's
handy.
right.
The SEC has fined Texas, has threatened to revoke their liquor license if
Wow.
they do not get this under control. Texas is in the process, or may have already identified the fans who threw that. And upon identification, what I have heard is they will not be allowed to attend any more games the rest of the season, which
Mhm.
is appropriate.
Absolutely.
But Darren, what do you think about that? When we know the emotions, we
Mhm.
scream at the TV, we
Mhm.
throw our hats across the room, we kick something, we get frustrated. What do you think about when the situation escalates to that point?
Well, first of all, you've got to give props to Steve Sarkeesian because even in the heat of the moment, he reacted immediately and headed over to that section to tell people to chill.
Hmm.
So enormous, enormous respect for him for that. And I think you could see it have an effect on the moment. I think it really did kind of back things down a little bit and allow the cleanup to take place, and there, in theory, not be that long of a delay until we knew the call was going to be reversed, and then have mercy. But in theory, it was progressing the game. So you got to give him props for that. But I struggle with that whole scenario because I think the immediate reaction is, number one, it's not okay. We're not going to condone that action by any fan in any fan base. We're also not going to do the old baby out with the bathwater and condone the entire Texas fan base, because that's not representative. They're an incredible fan base. It was a group of fans, collective in the moment, that made a bad decision. And like you said, the appropriate, as they identify people, the appropriate what is the action will be taken. There we go. Uh, so, but there have been a lot of people talking about penalizing the team, and I struggle with that because the team didn't do anything. They're in the middle of a heated game. They've already had the situation happen at the moment. Again, we didn't know the call was going to be reversed. And so there's been what is potentially an altering moment to the game that's taken place, and now you're going to penalize the players on the field for something that they have absolutely no control over. I think the appropriate action is fining the school, because the school can take future steps to try to maybe avoid stuff like that. So I'm completely, totally in favor of that. But I also think Kirby Smart, again, in his post-game press conference, made an incredible point of how scary this precedent is. So there's a call that you don't like. Hopefully, members of your fan base will throw things on the field to delay the game, and the referees will have time to reverse it. What a, just strictly from player and personnel safety, what a horrible precedent. Because I mean, what's like you said, once we open that door, what's the next step? I mean, is it just going to be this rain of beer bottles and mustard bottles and water bottles and stuff we've seen thrown in the past on the field until the fan base is satisfied, until there's been a long enough a delay? To me, there's some pretty scary, and scary might be an overdramatic term, and I don't mean to do that, but some pretty unsettling pieces of this that I think have to really be long, hard looked at by the SEC office.
Agreed. And I believe that's happening this week.
Yeah,
So I think the SEC is very good. Sankey is excellent at
absolutely,
addressing issues immediately before they
absolutely.
can grow into something else. So I have full confidence this will be addressed. This is not, as you said, not indicative of the entire Texas Longhorn fan base. This is a small group of people that made a bad decision, and they will
Okay.
have to suffer the consequences for that decision.
So we want to sum this up real quick. Horrible. Oh, here, egregious call. How's that? We'll use egregious. Egregious call that they should not have overturned because it's non-reviewable. Horrible Pandora's box that's been opened there. And no matter how upset you are, don't throw stuff on the field. Don't be silly. Is that our three? Is that our 3 points?
Perfect.
Awesome. All right.
E-
So what's your
Excellent,
say?
excellent summation. So that's our second takeaway
Yep.
combined. Let's move
Yep.
on to a third takeaway that we're going to do together as well.
Yep.
Darren, I want to bring up some coaches.
Okay.
You tell me how hot their seat is right now. Let's
Okay.
talk coaches on the hot seat. First up, Sam Pittman, Arkansas. Currently, the Hogs are at 4-3. They still have games at Mississippi State, Ole Miss at home, Texas at home, at Missouri, and throw in a game against Louisiana Tech. How hot is Sam Pittman's seat?
Well, you look at that schedule. Postseason is attainable. I think that's a reasonable, truthfully, probably a reasonable assumption. You can, even though there's been marked improvement by Mississippi State, you would assume that they can win that game. They can win the Louisiana Tech game. That gets them to 6 wins. pull off an upset that gets you to 7 wins and a bowl game, I think that cools the hot seat. The other side of that coin is, though, you slip up and lose to an improving Mississippi State, and your only win the remainder of the season is Louisiana Tech. You lose the rest of those games that you most likely aren't going to be favored in, and your only other win is Louisiana Tech, and you don't make a bowl again. I think it's an incredibly hot seat, and I think he might have enough goodwill in what he's done there that he survives it. So I don't think it's a hot plate hot seat, but I think his seat is cool as long as he gets to 7 wins. Win the 2 you're supposed to, pull off an upset, make a nice bowl appearance, you're good.
All right. Hugh Freeze, Auburn.
Oof.
The Tigers are currently 2-5, still with games at Kentucky, Vanderbilt, UL Monroe, A&M. They finish at Alabama. How hot is Hugh Freeze's seat?
If he loses to UL Monroe and Vanderbilt, he won't have a seat. I think they'll pull the money. Somebody will come up, Mr. Yellowwood, who's one of their big, I think he's writing a check. I think Hugh Freeze is headed somewhere else by the end of the UL Monroe game, if that happens. He won't make it to the Tuesday press conference. So I think he has his schedule, or the Auburn schedule makes his seat even hotter because there's nothing but traps. If you beat Vanderbilt, your fan base is going to say, no matter what Vanderbilt's done this year, your fan base is going to say, you should have beat Vanderbilt. If you beat Kentucky, especially the way they're looking right now, your fan base is going to say, well, you should have beat Kentucky. Same thing with UL Monroe. However, if you lose 2 or 3 of those games, especially if one of them is UL Monroe, you've got a rabid fan base that is, the old proverbial putting for sale signs in the front yard on Saturday night. This could go horribly even further off the rails, and his seat might be the one that's yanked first by the end of the season.
Let's get some clarity on the heat index for these seats,
Mm-hmm.
with 10 being the scorching, absolute hottest, 1 being cold. Let's go back. Where do you put Sam Pittman? What number?
I'd say our old buddy Sam's at about a 5. I think he has cooled his seat off throughout the process of the season. So
Hugh Freeze,
a minimum of a 7 right
7.
now. Yep.
Let's move on to the next coach, Mark Stoops at Kentucky. Currently, the Wildcats are 3-4. They still have games against Auburn, at Tennessee, Murray State, at Texas, and Louisville. How hot is Mark Stoops' seat?
So now that I think about his seat, I want to step back to Hugh Freeze and make him an 8, because I think he's hotter than Stoops. But I think Stoops' seat is hotter than Sam Pittman's. I think Stoops is probably at a 6. 2 things happening with the fan base. Number one, there's so many expectations during the off season. People were talking about, you went out and you got Brock Vandegrift. Your defense is going to be incredible. We're a little concerned about the offensive line, but and then you had the injury with the running back, and that hurt a little bit. But outside of those couple of things, there was a whole lot of positive talk. And now you're sitting with 3 wins over halfway through the season, and there's an inevitable, I think that's the word I'm looking for, an inevitable conversation that's going to start to take place within the fan base. We love what he's done the last 10 years. He's taken us from what would now be 12 through 16 to 8 through 12, maybe even 6 through 12, depending on the year. But can he get us to 5? Can he get us to 4? Can he keep us in 8 through 12 or 8 through 11, whatever it is? And I think that conversation is starting to take place. Then when you add to that, every time he loses a game, he compares his fan base to the other team's fan base and says, you guys aren't giving me enough money. I think that puts him at a solid 6.
Hmm.
As crazy as it sounds for somebody that's done what he's done for the last 10 years at Kentucky.
Two more coaches.
Okay.
The next one, Brent Venables from Oklahoma. Currently, the Sooners are 4-3. They still have games at Ole Miss. They get Maine at home, at Missouri, Alabama at home, and they finish at LSU. How hot is
Mm.
Venables' seat?
That's a very, very tough one because it's only his second year, correct? And they had, what did they have? How many wins did they have last year? 8?
And they just fired their offensive
And,
coordinator,
and
Seth Trow.
I think he made the necessary sacrifice. Let's be honest. Things start to get ugly. First one's on the chopping blocks. Whatever assistant's side of the ball looks the worst, right? That's just the way it works. And he did that. I think it was necessary. I don't think it was just a sacrifice. I think you can. Yes, there's been injuries. Yes, there's been concerns with offensive line injuries and wide receiver injuries. But man, when you've got the talent level that they can recruit at Oklahoma, and your offense looks the way it does, that's not okay. And I think there's something to be said for um, being willing to acknowledge, even though it's uncomfortable. Hey, bad call. That's on me. We're going to get through the rest of the season. We'll go find us a guy. I think that, as crazy as it sounds, as tough as the year is, I don't know that they're going to make a bowl game. I think that they've got to pull off an upset to be able to make a bowl game, and that won't help the Heat. But I think him being willing to make that tough call shows kind of an all-in mentality. I'm going to do what it takes to make this program successful, and I think the fan base loves him. And you're only 2 years in, so I think he's the coolest. He's a 4 or under. His seat is the coolest.
The last coach in our segment, Coaches on the Hot Seat, Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, in his first season. They're 5-2. They still have games against Missouri, at LSU, Mercer, at Oklahoma, and then the Iron Bowl with Auburn. How hot is DeBoer's seat?
He's just going to have to listen to a lot of chirping. I don't know administratively how hot his seat is because it's his first year. He was in the playoff last year. This is not a guy that all of a sudden just forgot how to coach and forgot how to win. I think they're having some obvious offense issues. There's a disconnect. Something's going with Jalen Milroe. Jalen Monroe. I guess I'm still talking about UL Monroe. Jalen Milroe and his comfort level in the offense. I think you're seeing that, and I think people that are making decisions can see that. The fan base is going to chirp and they're not going to be happy. But I honestly, I don't think he has any heat on his seat at all. It's his first year. It's a new system. You're following the man who now has the field named after him. I think everybody in the administration knows that. There's not going to be enough big money people screaming at this point yet. But I do also think he has to finish strong. He cannot get under 8-9 wins because that will turn the heat up. I think he's got to finish strong and he'll be fine. I don't even think there'll be coordinator changes necessarily at this point.
What number do you give him on the Heat Index?
Like let's see, I gave Oklahoma Brent Venables. I gave him a 4. So we'll go with a 2 because it's his first year. He's a 2.
All right. So there you go. Coaches on the hot seat, according to Darren's analysis. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let us hear your comments.
Yeah.
And while you're commenting, be sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button. Keep up with all the episodes as they come out. As we look back on this weekend, let's go into our 4-down territory and give our brown bag award for the weekend. This isn't really an award. It's an award of shame. We're shaming
Yeah.
people.
There you go. um,
Why are we shaming people on a podcast?
because sometimes you just got to call stuff out. And I was going to say we don't do it to the same people all the time, but that might not be true this week.
Well, let's not sound like some preachers at a revival somewhere. So, who's your brown bag for this week, Darren?
I'm going to go with Mark Stoops in Kentucky. You just can't have a loss like that. I know that there have been issues and there have been struggles in your offensive line and this and that, but you just can't. And it's not just a shot at Kentucky with the way Vanderbilt's season going right now. If they would have lost, which I was horribly afraid of throughout most of the first half, if they would have lost, I'd be saying the same thing. You just can't do it. You can't have some of the highs that they've had this year with the expectations, and then just absolutely blow a game like that. It just you can't do it. So that's my brown bag pick of the week. How about you?
I'm asking two groups to share the brown bag for this week: the officials in the Georgia Texas game
Yeah,
and the fans from Texas that
good
threw
call.
debris onto the field. You both get the brown bag, and you're going to have to sit together to wear it.
In the brown bag, and you have to lock arms with the officials. That's what you.
How about your post game quote of the week? What do you find for us, Darren?
Yeah, we're gonna let our good friend. As a matter of fact, he's such a friend. We might call him family. Brian Kelly, he had a couple of moments in his press conference, one at the very beginning, one at the very end. So just want to play that really kind of stood out to me for two different reasons. So let's listen to a couple of things that Coach Kelly had to say after their big game against Arkansas.
Game ball went out to Damian Ramos. I thought the field goal kicks, while the game was still in balance, helped us, stay ahead of it and keep the momentum. And now we got to go do it again against a really good Texas A&M team at their place. I know this was homecoming. I'm sure they'll schedule homecoming next week there against us too. It just seems like we get everybody's homecoming. So maybe next year they'll think about maybe not making us homecoming anymore.
So two things that stood out there. Number one, we've talked a lot about kickers taking it on the chin from coaches throughout our years of doing this podcast. So to hear a coach talk about giving a kicker a game ball and acknowledging the fact that the kicker basically kept their momentum at times, I thought was pretty awesome. So props to Brian Kelly for being willing to do that. Very, very awesome. But then I also thought it was kind of funny for him to say, well, maybe next year they'll figure out that we shouldn't be your homecoming. I thought that was very calmly but emphatically made. I thought that was very well done on his part.
Very tactfully done.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
I watched the game with family. When my wife realized it was Arkansas's homecoming, she looked over at me and she said, "Why did they make the LSU game their homecoming game?"
I don't understand
I don't know, honey.
that.
I don't know.
Well, for years, Vanderbilt would make Georgia their homecoming game. I'm talking about like the 90s. Every time Georgia came to Nashville, they made them homecoming. I'm like, what are you? Who who makes that decision? What are you doing? Last week played Charleston Southern, but this week is homecoming against Georgia. That makes sense.
Let's look ahead to this upcoming week and the matchups that are still looming ahead. Who is your sure thing pick for this week?
I think I'm going to go with Ole Miss. I hate to do this to our Oklahoma, the Oklahoma fan base, but there's just so much turmoil. Their defense has done well, but I don't think their offense is going to be able to keep their defense off the field, and that is a recipe for disaster against a Lane Kiffin offense. They're a 21-point favorite. I, Ole Miss is my sure thing. How about you?
Darren, as you are often prone to do, you support your team through thick and thin. I'm going to put it out there. I am making LSU my sure thing for this week
Nice.
at Kyle Field. It's going to be crazy,
Hmm.
like 107,000 people or more. I don't know if we can even count that much.
Yeah.
Mike Elko's got the Aggies playing incredible ball. It's going to be a hard fought game. As you mentioned, field goal kickers and Brian Kelly's. press conference, Damian Ramos may be the difference in this game. So I'm gonna go with the Tigers. How about your upset pick for the week?
I will continue your trend. I said 3 weeks ago, or actually 2 weeks ago, after the Alabama win, that whether sure thing or upset, I was going to pick Vanderbilt until they prove me wrong. So I'm going to stick to my word. They are a 13 and a half. Is that? No, 18 and a half point underdog favorite. Yeah. 18 and a half point underdog to Texas. And I still am going to roll with it. They were a 27 and a half point underdog to Alabama. So 18 doesn't scare me. Vanderbilt is my upset pick. How about you?
I'm going out on a limb here. Jeff Lebby and Mississippi State are still looking for that big win. They have been in the games. They have fought. They just have
Yeah.
come short in all these games. This week, the Razorbacks are coming and licking their wounds off a disappointing loss to LSU. How will they respond to that? I think they are ripe for an upset. I'm going to go with Mississippi State pulling off a shocker against the Razorbacks. Michael Van Buren
Wow.
continues to grow as a quarterback. The defense finally steps up. I think Mississippi State pulls it off.
Nice. That'll be a big, big win for that program if they pull off that upset. Be a nice moment.
So thank you for watching. Let us know who your picks are for this week. New episodes drop every Tuesday at some point during the day, and we like to surprise you, keep you on the edge of your seat. Yet, if you hit that subscribe button, you don't have to keep refreshing your YouTube feed and looking. Well, is it dropped yet? Is it dropped yet? Because you will receive a notification. So please hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to us.
Absolutely.
Until next week, y'all enjoy the games and take care.
Have a great week. Thank you for making the Brew and Shaver Sports Podcast your go-to sports show. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review our show if you haven't already. Your feedback is important. Let us know what you think about this week's show. Send an email to brewandshavers@gmail.com or text to our text line 318-390-3599. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for listening to the Brew and Shaver Sports Podcast. See you next week.